The Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, when advancing became a death sentence. If you only looked at the numbers, this battle should not exist. Rome brought one of the largest armies it had ever assembled. More men, more discipline, more confidence than ever before. And yet, by the end of the day, tens of thousands were dead. Not scattered, not routed, erased. This is often described as a tactical masterpiece, a brilliant double envelopment, a stroke of military genius. That description is incomplete. Because Rome did not lose at Cannae due to clever tricks. They lost because they believed something that felt obvious, that advancing harder, deeper, with more force, could only lead to victory. At Cannae, Rome did exactly what every instinct told them to do. They pushed forward, they pressed the center, they committed everything. And every step they took made the trap tighter. This is not a story about surprise. Rome was not ambushed. It is not a story about panic. They did not break and run. It is a story about certainty, about an army so sure of its own momentum that it never considered stopping. At Tours, history changed because an army refused to move. At Cannae, history changed because an army could not stop moving forward. To understand why Rome walked into destruction calmly, deliberately, and with full confidence, we need to understand what momentum does to the people who trust it too much. And we need to understand the man who did not rush to close the trap, but waited for Rome to close it on itself.
Roman momentum, when certainty replaced thinking. Before Cannae, Rome had already decided how this war would end. Not on the battlefield, not in tactics, but in belief. Rome believed the problem was simple. They had lost before because they had not committed enough. Not enough men, not enough pressure, not enough force applied in one place. So Rome did what Rome trusted most. They doubled down. They raised one of the largest armies the Republic had ever fielded. Not an elite force, a mass. Because Roman warfare was built on a core assumption that discipline plus numbers would always prevail. And most of the time, it did. Roman momentum was not speed, it was weight. Step after step, shield after shield, pressure that did not stop. Roman legions were designed to advance, not to maneuver, not to hesitate. They pushed, they absorbed losses, and they kept pushing. This had worked against almost everyone they had faced before. So by the time Rome marched toward Cannae, they were not improvising. They were executing what they believed to be the correct answer. That belief is what made Cannae possible. Rome did not see itself as entering a trap. Rome believed it was closing one. The plan was brutally straightforward. Advance the center, apply maximum pressure, crush the enemy line through sheer force. No flanking brilliance, no subtlety, just certainty. And certainty is dangerous, because certainty narrows vision. When an army believes it already understands the solution, it stops asking questions. Questions like, why is the enemy center yielding? Why are we being allowed to advance? Why does resistance feel controlled? At Cannae, Rome interpreted every sign through the lens of confidence. The enemy falling back? Proof that pressure is working. The line bending inward? Evidence of collapse. The deeper they advanced, the more certain they became that victory was inevitable. Momentum had stopped being a tool. It had become an assumption, and assumptions are invisible until they fail. This is the difference between Tours and Cannae. At Tours, one side refused to move and broke momentum from the outside. At Cannae, Rome carried its momentum forward and turned it inward. The army was not reckless, it was obedient, not arrogant, confident. And that confidence was shared, not by one general, not by a few officers, but by tens of thousands of men who all believed the same thing. If we keep moving forward, we will win. That shared belief is what makes Cannae different from a simple tactical defeat. This was not one mistake. It was a collective decision repeated with every step forward. And the more Rome advanced, the harder it became to stop, because stopping would mean questioning the belief that had brought them this far. And that is where the real danger lay, because somewhere ahead there was an enemy commander who understood Roman certainty perfectly, a man who did not rush to close the trap, because he knew Rome would do it for him. Hannibal, the trap Rome never felt closing. There is a moment in every battle when the future still contains options. At Cannae, that moment passed without anyone noticing. Not because Hannibal hit it, but because Rome walked past it willingly. Hannibal did not arrange his army to shock Rome. He arranged it to feel familiar. The Roman commanders looked at the field and saw nothing alarming. The enemy's center stood in front of them. The flanks held position. The terrain was open. Everything looked normal. That was the trap. Hannibal understood something simple and lethal. Rome did not need surprise. Rome needed confirmation. Confirmation that the old answer was still the right one. Advance, press, overwhelm. So Hannibal gave them exactly that. The center that invited belief. At the center, the Carthaginian line did not resist aggressively, but it did not collapse either. This distinction is critical. A collapsing enemy produces caution. A fleeing enemy raises questions. A retreating enemy, one that retreats in order, produces confidence. The Roman soldiers did not see weakness. They saw success in progress. Each step forward felt earned, not dramatic, not sudden, just correct. The Romans advanced because that is what Roman battles always demanded next. No horns of warning, no signal that something had changed, only the quiet reinforcement of belief. This is working. Time as the invisible weapon. What Hannibal was buying was not space, it was time. Time for the Roman center to move too far forward to hear anything but its own momentum. Time for the Roman flanks to become irrelevant to the men in the middle. Time for the army to stop thinking as a whole. Momentum fractures awareness. Men in front feel progress. Men behind feel pressure. No one feels the shape of the battlefield anymore. Rome was still functioning, but it was no longer perceiving. On the flanks, Hannibal's strongest troops stood still. This is the hardest order to obey in battle. To stand while the enemy moves past you. To hold while victory seems within reach. To do nothing while history appears to be unfolding in front of you. But this was discipline of a different kind. Not the discipline to advance, the discipline to wait. Every Roman unit that pushed deeper made the flanks more irrelevant. Not tactically, psychologically. The Roman center stopped expecting help from the sides. The battle had narrowed inside their own heads. The point of no return that felt like progress. There was no order that sealed Rome's fate, no command shouted too late, no moment where the army could have turned and said, "This is wrong," because at no point did the situation feel wrong enough. That is the horror of Cannae. The battle did not punish recklessness, it punished obedience. By the time Hannibal ordered the flanks inward, Rome had already lost the ability to imagine stopping. Stopping would have meant admitting that the last hour of forward motion had been a mistake. Armies, like people, resist that realization. So Rome kept moving, not because it chose to, but because it no longer knew how not to. The trap did not close. It simply became impossible to leave.
No way out when realization came too late. The most terrifying thing about Battle of Cannae is not how the Romans died, it is how long they lived after the battle had already been decided. There was no single instant when the Roman army realized it was surrounded. Realization did not arrive like a shock, it arrived like pressure. When space started to disappear. At first, the Roman soldiers noticed nothing unusual. Battles are crowded, men bump into each other, formations compress. That was normal. So when the space between shields grew tighter, no one panicked. They assumed the pressure would release once the enemy finally broke. That is what always happened. But the pressure did not release. The ground beneath their feet was churned into dust and blood. Every step forward required effort. Every breath felt heavier. The men behind pushed. The men in front could not move faster. And slowly, without command, movement turned into congestion. The moment advancement stopped being a choice. This is where momentum becomes a prison. Some soldiers wanted to stop advancing. They could not. Others wanted to turn sideways, to widen the formation. There was no space. Shields locked not by discipline, but by necessity. Arms pressed against ribs, helmets knocked together. Men were no longer fighting the enemy, they were fighting density. This is when the Roman army ceased to function as an army. Order still existed, but they could not travel. Sound died in the mass of bodies. Signals were invisible. The man at the center no longer knew what was happening even 10 meters away. Realization without options. At some point, different for every man, the realization came. Not shouted, not announced, felt. A Roman soldier would turn his head and see enemy faces where Roman shields should have been. Another would try to step backward and feel only bodies. Another would lift his sword and find his arm trapped. That is when understanding set in. Not "we are losing," but "we cannot leave." This is a crucial difference. An army that is losing still has choices. An army that cannot move has none. Time stretched, not collapsed. This is where popular retellings fail. Cannae was not a sudden slaughter. It was slow, painfully slow. Hours passed. Men stood pressed together under the sun, unable to sit, unable to fall. Some suffocated, some collapsed and were trampled without anyone intending it. Those still standing could not help them. The Carthaginians did not rush the killing. They did not need to. The Romans were already immobilized. Every Roman advantage, discipline, formation,
cohesion, had become useless once space disappeared. Shields designed to face forward could not protect against blows from the side. Training meant for movement meant nothing in stillness. The final failure, command. At some point, Roman command ceased to exist, not because commanders died, though many did, but because command requires motion. It requires the ability to shift units, to open space, to redirect force. None of that was possible anymore. The Roman army had not broken, it had solidified. This is the final irony of Cannae. Rome's greatest strength, its ability to press forward together, became the mechanism of its destruction. The army did not collapse outward, it collapsed inward. By the time the sun began to drop, the outcome was no longer in doubt. But the killing did not stop because there was nowhere for it to go. Cannae was no longer a battlefield. It was a closed space, slowly emptying of life.
Aftermath and legacy. What Cannae took from Rome. When the killing finally slowed, what remained at Battle of Cannae was not victory, it was absence. The field did not look like a battlefield. It looked like something had been removed. Not scattered bodies from a rout, not lines broken in retreat, just mass, stillness, silence heavy enough to feel physical. Rome had lost tens of thousands of men in a single day. Not recruits, not mercenaries, citizens, veterans, men who formed the spine of the Republic. Families in Rome would not hear the news all at once. It arrived in fragments. A name missing, a unit that never returned, a silence where certainty used to be. Rome did not collapse, and that is the point. This is where most stories about Cannae become misleading. They imply that a disaster of this scale should have ended Rome. It didn't. And that is precisely why Cannae mattered so much. Rome survived, but it was no longer the same Rome. Because Rome understood what had happened, not just tactically, but structurally. They did not blame cowardice. They did not blame fate. They blamed themselves. Specifically, they blamed the belief that size and pressure could solve everything. The war Rome stopped fighting. After Cannae, Rome changed its behavior in ways that felt unnatural to it. It avoided decisive battles. It refused direct confrontation. This was not fear. It was restraint learned through trauma. Rome began to fight a war that denied Hannibal what he was best at. No massed formations, no clean geometry, no certainty. They delayed, they harassed, they starved the conflict of resolution. This was Rome learning how to stop. The same Rome that had marched itself into a prison now refused to walk into one again. Why Cannae never stopped mattering. Cannae did not become famous because of its bloodshed. It became famous because it revealed a pattern that goes far beyond ancient warfare. Momentum feels like intelligence. Certainty feels like strength, until they erase choice. For centuries, military thinkers studied Cannae not to copy Hannibal's movements, but to understand Rome's mistake. The double envelopment is easy to diagram. The psychology is harder to accept, because it suggests something uncomfortable, that the most dangerous enemy is not deception. It is the belief that continuing forward must be correct simply because you have already committed. Cannae and Tours, the same lesson,
in verse. This is where Cannae finally connects back to everything that came before it. At Tours, history turned because an army refused to move. At Cannae, history turned because an army could not stop moving. One side survived by holding its ground. The other died by believing ground no longer mattered. These are not opposite stories. They are mirror images. Both reveal the same truth. History does not reward motion. It rewards judgment. And judgment disappears the moment certainty replaces thinking. The last thing Cannae left behind. Cannae did not destroy Rome. It destroyed an illusion. The illusion that progress is automatic, that pressure always works, that the next step forward is always safer than stopping. Rome learned that lesson at the cost of an entire army. And unlike many who suffer disasters, Rome remembered. That is why Cannae still speaks to us, not as a tale of genius, not as a lesson in tactics, but as a warning. Sometimes the most fatal mistake is not choosing the wrong direction. It is believing you no longer need to choose at all.